Good evening, everyone. Noswaith pawb. I'm going to be changing focus slightly here, so we're going to be looking at those problematic ornamentals that spread from gardens and those invasive species. So I'm going to focus mostly on our Garden Escapers project, touching slightly on some of the research that I've done, but I'm happy to answer questions towards the end, which are more research focused. So I think I'll start with a quick introduction to myself for context. So I firstly got into this topic of invasive species of garden origin whilst I was working at Tebeth Botanic Garden in North Wales as a horticulturist, and I've been working in this area for about 10 years now. Almost finished my PhD on the topic of potentially invasive garden plants. I'm currently with Coventry University as a research fellow. But I also work with North Wales Wildlife Trust more on the engagement side, so delivering events and workshops to increase awareness of invasive species. So for context, that's where I'm coming from, and that's me there tackling an invasive species represented by a triffid. So invasive species is the topic, and I normally frame invasive species, at least at a global scale, using this IPBES Global Assessment Report back in 2019. So they identified 5 drivers of the nature crisis, essentially. You can see the 5 drivers on the slide now. Changes in land and sea use. A good example would be deforestation. Nothing new there. That's been an issue, a recognised issue for decades, as has direct exploitation of organisms, so overfishing, for example. Of course, climate change is now pretty much part of common narrative. And pollution is very topical at the moment. A lot of accusations being thrown at water companies. So those are 4. I often argue that invasive species represented here on the slide with the grey squirrel might get much less attention as one of those drivers of the nature crisis. So that's the framing, if you will, at a global scale at least. And of course, these drivers are interlinked. And I'll touch on the link between climate change and invasive species towards the end of the talk. Normally, when I'm giving a presentation or a talk, for example, to a local gardening group, I will explicitly ask gardeners how they understand the term invasive. That aspect of my PhD research has now been published in Environmental Science and Policy, but I'm happy to address some of the questions towards the end. Because of the length of the talk this evening, I'm going to offer my definition for this evening, at least, so that you understand what I mean. So when I'm referring to invasive species, I am referring to non-native species, which have been introduced by humans from every corner of the world. And critically, they have an impact, so they either threaten biodiversity, human health, or the economy. Invasive species are estimated to cost at £4 billion annually in the UK alone, so that's just one figure. But the research suggests that gardeners might not be aware of this threat or impact of invasive species escaping gardens, and that's despite the fact that ornamental horticulture is the main source of invasive species globally. Yet there's a crucial role to play. I'm a gardener myself, so I'll touch on some aspects in which gardeners can play a role when we're looking at invasive species during this talk. So let's look at more of a local level. I frame it as a global issue, but if we bring it down to a very, very local level and look at gardens and the wild, I always touch on the benefits initially of wildlife gardening. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to present to you as the Wildlife Gardening Forum tonight, but I do touch on this before I get onto the doom and gloom, if you will, of invasive species. And it's important to point out the benefits, and these aren't my research expertise. But supporting biodiversity and ecosystem services, of course, we've touched on that this evening, improving human health, and physical and mental health, and then mitigating the impact of climate change. But as I say, the topic of tonight is maybe the other side of the coin, and those potential negative impacts of invasive species. And you can think of the invasion process as a story, essentially. So on the slide, we've got a continuum of a story. We're starting on the left, we've got Chinese windmill palm representing gardens with a picket fence. Some of these species escape into the wild. Lambsia, water lettuce to a lesser degree. Those are just 2 examples, and I'll touch on some of the numbers in a second. Some of these garden escapers will naturalize. And what I mean there is that they have a self-reproducing population in the wild. But it is the invasive species, or it's those with a negative detrimental impact that are particularly concerning. And perspective is very important here. So on the blue circle, and the blue circle on the left, that represents the native flora of Britain and Ireland. We've touched on the distinction between native and non-native already this evening. That's from the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland's Plant Atlas that was published last year. So the native taxa, native plants, sorry, in the blue, and you can compare that, if you will, with the garden flora, which is much bigger in number. When we're looking at the garden flora, the RHS Plant Finder is often used as a proxy. The latest issue had around 70,000 different entries in there. That includes all the different cultivars, varieties, and so on. That circle wouldn't fit on the slide. So there's an estimated 17,000 species in the Plant Finder. The exact number doesn't matter, it's the relative size of the circles, and that number will include native taxa. But as I said, it's the relative number of the size of the circles that we need to look at. So if we take that grey circle to represent the garden flora in Britain and Ireland, the pink circle within it essentially represents the escapees, those garden escapers that you'll find in the wild. And the red represents those that have the invasive label, so have a detrimental impact on biodiversity, the economy, or human health. And the point I'm making here is, even though ornamental horticulture is a main source of invasive species, it's a relatively small number that have that sort of impact, and that perspective is quite important. So let's look at 3 examples of invasive species quickly. I've chosen 3 specifically that are still widely planted, common ornamentals. I haven't looked at any that are listed in legislation or banned from sale, because I think these 3 examples are more relevant to this evening. So if I start with cherry laurel, for each of the 3 examples, I'll give you some statistics, or numbers rather. I'm not going to go through them, but the difference between the date of introduction and the first record in the wild is quite interesting, because it tends to be very stochastic, ranging from only a few years to centuries. So if we're looking at cherry laurel from Southern Europe, there was about 160 years between its introduction as an ornamental and then first record in the wild for this case. Of course, very popular hedging as an ornamental. And the reasons for which it's common and popular for hedging is also the reasons for which it can be very invasive. So it's an evergreen, of course, and the seeds are dispersed by birds very often. So if those seeds are dispersed into nearby woodland, especially broadleaf deciduous woodland, the evergreen nature of cherry laurel means it creates a very dense shade, which outcompetes the flora that you'd ordinarily find on the forest floor. So in this case, an impact on biodiversity, essentially, for the reasons, as I say, for it being a popular hedging plant, also gives the reason for its invasive impact. Second example is Cotoneaster horizontalis specifically. There's a few different Cotoneasters of garden origin that are invasive in Britain and Ireland, but I'll focus here on Cotoneaster horizontalis. Interesting from a wildlife gardening forum point of view, because of course in summer this is buzzing with insects, raising much wider issues about invasive species and their role perhaps in providing ecosystem services. And wall Cotoneaster horizontalis is a good example of why invasive species are not an issue that you can describe as being black and white. There's a lot of nuances involved here. Again, the seeds are dispersed by birds. The impacts are mostly in limestone habitats, limestone grasslands. Here in North Wales, we have Cotoneaster campicus, which is a native critically endangered species. So North Wales Wildlife Trust are doing a lot of work in removing invasive Cotoneasters from those limestone grassland habitats, where it's having an impact on the native species. Cotoneaster campicus is, as I say, critically endangered. Invasive species are not the only reason for that. There's a risk of hybridization. The main reason for its critically endangered status is overgrazing by goats, but there is an interaction and potential risk posed by invasive cotoneasters escaping nearby gardens. The third example of what we already consider invasive, at least in certain habitats, is maybe the most contentious one. Similar to the cotoneaster, buzzing with insects in summer can again be quite invasive on limestone habitats. Here may be more of an economic impact as an invasive species. You only need to go on a railway journey to see the railway embankments dominated by Davidiae, but also an economic cost in the damage to infrastructure. A topic that's particularly interesting to me at the moment is the potential economic cost of managing it on scheduled monuments such as castles, and that hasn't yet been quantified, but that's something I'm currently exploring. So those are three examples that have the invasive species label, at least locally, depending on habitats and so on. So how can gardeners help? There are two ways, essentially. I'm going to focus here on becoming citizen scientists, but I'll touch at the very end on how you can help whilst actually enjoying your garden. So here I'm going to focus on a project called Plant Alert that we've been promoting here in North West Wales through our Garden Escapers project. So gardeners can be the first to observe ornamentals showing invasive potential. Importantly, gardeners can identify this invasive potential early in the invasion process. If you think back to the continuum I gave you on one slide earlier on, it's critical that we know which species have invasive potential early, so we can take steps to avoid the problem. It costs less, and it also avoids the potential impact on biodiversity. But we need to think about how we can capture this data and information. And that's the whole premise or the principle behind Plant Alert. So this is led by Coventry University and the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. It's a citizen science project where gardeners can essentially report plants within their gardens showing invasive behaviour. So it's a website, you don't need to register, it's free to use, but it gives us a lot of data to explore. So when we're looking at Plant Alert in terms of results at the moment, these are the top 5 ornamentals reported on Plant Alert currently. So on the left, you can see the results from North West Wales, and on the right, the results from Britain and Ireland. They're not directly comparable because they're running on different timescales and different geographies. There's a mixture here of widely regarded invasive species. I've already mentioned Cotoneaster horizontalis, which is reported at least 4 times in North West Wales. Unutia japonica, Japanese knotweed, of course, probably the most well-known invasive species in Britain and Ireland. But we also have ornamentals here that are not currently regarded as invasive. Those are represented in bold. And what essentially Plant Alert allows us to do is to prioritize the wealth of ornamentals we have going in gardens, going back to the slide with the circular diagram, is to prioritize which of those 70,000 different ornamentals might have invasive potential, because we can explore that invasive potential in different ways, which I'll touch on in a second. So if we put these under the sort of umbrella of future invaders, one of the main aspects to explore is the interaction between their invasive potential and climate change. At the very beginning, I mentioned that there's an interaction between those drivers of the nature crisis. And here there's a clear interaction between climate change and invasive species. That's for a few different reasons. Ornamentals have had a head start to climate change because of the reason we've been moving them to the different corners of the world. Opportunities for gardeners to experiment with new plants. So climate change gives us an opportunity to succeed with new ornamentals that maybe a few years ago would have still been challenging. And lastly, climate change is known to facilitate that invasion process, that continuum steps. For that reason, we need to explore what impact climate change might have on some of these potentially invasive taxa. To do that, I'm going to use one example, which is Rodinia caudata. A lot of you will be familiar with this. It's very common, ornamental, very popular. first recorded in the wild in 1992. It's a rapidly spreading perennial, often growing on the pond margins, and that's because it prefers damp ground. In Britain and Ireland, it's naturalized, but with limited distribution. So it does have a self-reproducing population, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of being naturalized, but this distribution is currently limited. We can explore this impact of climate change using a method called species distribution modeling. So the maps on the slide now are not conclusive, but I'm using them to illustrate how this method can be used. So essentially on the left, you've got a map representing today, current climate suitability, and then on the right, a projection to 2070. And the maps essentially show you the climatic suitability for this one case study species for Rhotinia cordata. So it's a scale of climate suitability. So the greens are areas which are climatically suitable compared to the whites and the pinks, which are climatically less suitable. And all species distribution modeling does essentially is look at a plant's current distribution, be it nationally or at a global level, and match that to current climate. And with that relationship, you can project forward using climate projections, in this case to 2070. And you'll see on the slide there's a difference in pattern. There's a difference in where in Britain and Ireland is climatically suitable for Rhotinia cordata. So if we look at much of England, based on this species distribution modeling, it becomes climatically less suitable. I'm not a climate scientist, but if we look at climate change projections at very broad brush level, we are expecting hotter, drier summers, especially in the southeast, which will not suit Rhotinia cordata because of its preferred growing conditions. As I said, the maps here are not conclusive, but hopefully it illustrates how the method works. And there's one example of how we can use the shortlist coming from Plant Alert to sort of measure and explore the invasive potential a bit better. Other methods are to do a risk assessment and also horizon scanning. But this is a very good approach when we're looking at the interaction with climate change specifically. You as gardeners can also help when it comes to tackling invasive species whilst enjoying the act of gardening, if you will. And this is summarized to a campaign called Pea Plant Wise. So this is led by the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat. It's been running for a few years now. The whole point of Pea Plant Wise is to increase awareness of invasive species and to promote these 3 simple steps in terms of stopping or at least reducing the spread of invasive species escaping gardens. So the first step is to know what you grow, to know whether or not you've got an invasive species in the garden. Is it invasive locally? That's critical because the spatial scale is really important here. Knowing what you grow, but also then looking at it as a bit of an opportunity, knowing what alternatives there are. And for this, the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat have developed a booklet called Gardening Without Harmful Plants. It's available as a PDF. I'll ask Mark to circulate the link during the questions. But that's a nice guide. It's split into sections, and it does have a section for wildlife gardening as well. So please explore that. And yeah, as I say, we'll share the link in a second. The second step here is to stop the spread. So if you do have an invasive species in the garden, taking steps to stopping it escaping into the wild, because it is in the wild that they have this impact on biodiversity. And those can be simple steps like deadheading a butterfly bush. They produce thousands of seed. Simply by deadheading, you're limiting that source of seed escaping to the wild. And then thirdly, composting with care. I'm not touched on invasive species that are classified as controlled waste here, but simple, pretty much common sense steps in composting. But there's guidance again here on the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat website in which plants, invasive species, do not necessarily compost well domestically if you don't have a big compost, but also not to dispose of garden waste into the wild, which does happen occasionally. So there's steps you can also take whilst enjoying the garden and the act of gardening. So if I'm to conclude briefly, As I say, invasive species are one of the main threats to nature globally. Those 5 direct drivers. But beyond having a biodiversity impact, they can also impact the economy, estimated in the UK alone at 4 billion, and an impact on human health. And although ornamental horticulture is the main source of invasive species globally, there is a lot that we gardeners can do to tackle this. Register plants on Plant Alert and be plant wise. But in short, the key message is don't stop gardening. Hopefully I've given you solutions as opposed to focusing too much on the doom and gloom. And at that point, I'll take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tomos, for that. Fascinating, really fascinating. And it dovetailed really nicely with what Francesca was talking about as well. Right, so questions. I'm going to do my best here. Well, before we go into questions, I just wish my wife was listening about the cherry laurel, because I told her it's not the best plant to put in the hedge, but she insisted because of its evergreen screening qualities. Yep. So, yeah, what can we do? Anyway, right, first question. So I'm going to start with one from Susan, and she's asking, and this may be linked to what you were talking about there in your sort of bee plant wise report, Tomos, but is there a reliable list of invasive plants somewhere that you could recommend gardeners to avoid?
The simple answer is no, if I'm honest, and that is because the impacts can be quite local. I would encourage you to go on the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat website, but also look at Bee Plant Wise and the booklet I mentioned. I'll drop the link to the booklet in the chat now. The reason there is no conclusive list is because the impact can be local, and therefore having a national list is not therefore the best option. But some of the widely known ones will be listed in the guide and on the website, on the GB Non-Native Species website. But that's the main reason we haven't got a conclusive list. There is a great book called Alien Plants by Stace and Crowley that was published in 2015 that explores this issue, and they've got quite a good list on naturalized and invasive taxa.
Brilliant. And I can see that Judith put a link as well to Plant Alert in the chat, which could be helpful. So thanks for doing that, Judith. Okay, so next question then. So Jenny is sort of asking a practical question. So she's asking about seeds, which on the packet will say that they're packed in the UK, but there's no information about the origin of them. What would your recommendation be in that sort of case?
So here we're sort of touching on a different level of impact, which I've not really looked at during the talk. So most of my impacts I looked at the species level pretty much. But one impact is that on different genotypes. So if you're using different genotypes within the garden, there's a risk of hybridization with native taxa. Again, it's the issue of spatial scale. Having local provenance seed is by far the best option, but that's not always practical. So you might need to be using seed from your local garden centre, for example. It's not always practical to get local provenance seed, but that's, of course, the ideal situation.
Sure. Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, next question from Alison. So she was asking, obviously you touched a lot on Buddleia and how invasive it was. She's also asking about some of the cultivars of Buddleia davidi and how invasive they might be known to be. Are they still a problem?
Yeah, I don't know of any conclusive evidence on this. The cultivars seem to be less invasive than the true Buddleia davidi.
Yeah,
that could be because of popular pressure. So one of the main drivers of invasive species is popular pressure. So essentially, how popular or how popular that ornamental is. There's much higher popular pressure for the species of the davidi than many of the cultivars, but they do seem less invasive. So when you do see butterfly bush in the wild, it tends to be the species. But I'm not sure of any conclusive evidence on that.
Yeah, more research needed. We always say that, don't we? But there's quite a few questions coming in around, I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit, but essentially the role that gardeners might be playing in terms of facilitating the plants able to adapt to climate change. So Steve, for example, say, do we know what the climate will be like in Wales in sort of 50 years' time? And, what sort of flora might be appropriate into the future. So yeah, what role maybe should gardeners be thinking of playing in terms of how do we help plants, native or I guess non-native, almost to be able to adapt to that change?
Yeah, this opens a can of worms almost in terms
Yeah.
of looking at the nuances of invasive species. So if you give a particular plant that label, it doesn't necessarily consider the potential benefits that might play in the changing climates. So if we're looking at changing phenologies, for example, what role do even invasive ornamentals have in providing ecosystem services when different drivers of the nature crisis are dominant, such as climate change? As I say, it's opening a can of worms. It's almost a talk in itself. And there are ethical considerations there also in terms of if an ornamental is at risk or endangered within its native range, what role does this non-native range play in its conservation at a global scale? So there's loads of ethical issues involved there as well.
Yeah, no, good point.
Answer, maybe.
It sounds like we're going to have another talk on that as well, Thomas. So we'll welcome you back for that when you've researched that one. Okay, a couple more questions before we're going to finish at 8 o'clock. So Susan's asking, so are garden centres still allowed to actually sell some of these harmful non-natives that obviously we know cherry laurel is widely available, Cotonia ester, horizontalis. I mean, as far as I know, they're still all widely sold. And can there not be some legislation against some of these, the trading of these plants?
Yeah, so the 3 examples I'm giving you tonight, as I said during the talk, I chose specifically because they're still widely available. So I thought they were more appropriate for this evening. There are certain ornamentals which are now banned from sale. One example is American skunk cabbage. So you shouldn't see that being sold in garden centres because it's on a legal list. So there are legal mechanisms to deal with the issue of invasive species. Risk assessments and that species distribution modelling that I mentioned in the talk, they feed into what species need to be listed in legislation, but that's only one mechanism. Increasing awareness of the issue amongst gardeners is definitely another mechanism, and the really important one, because we will never succeed in getting the right species on any legal list for a variety of reasons. There's definitely a role in increasing awareness.
Yeah. No, great. Thank you. One final question, if I may, before we wrap up. And this is from Nigel. And he's asking, how big of a problem is the hybridization of sort of wild natives with cultivars? And he's given the example of English bluebells and Spanish bluebells. Do you know much about that as an issue?
Yeah, so hybridization risk is in my research expertise, but if we're looking at bluebells specifically, bluebells growing in gardens are mostly the hybrid between British bluebell and English bluebell the British bluebell and Spanish bluebell, rather than being the true Spanish bluebell, and that's also true in the wild. Any non-native examples tend to be the hybrid. So there is a hybridization risk there. It goes back to my point of the different genotypes as well. And using local provenance seed goes back to that point. It's on my level of expertise, but there's definitely very recent studies that have looked specifically at the issue of the bluebells. And I think the reference has just been put in the chat, actually.
Great. We do have a great community of people here, often answering each other's questions, which saves us a job. So brilliant. Look, it's 8 o'clock, so I'm going to leave it there for questions. And it may be that a few answers are still flying in now. I can't quite keep on track of it, but